I'm delighted to be able to welcome you here for the annual Moran Weston Distinguished Lecture in Public Policy. On September 11th, 2001, we looked out these windows in the morning to see the huge plume of smoke and ash that filled the sky. And we understood, had we ever had any questions about it, the importance of emergency planning and emergency management. And we began, over the course of the next several weeks and months, to understand how complicated that arena is, as we learned about the efforts of the various government agencies, particularly, of course, the police and fire departments, the Red Cross, that is civil society and the voluntary sector, the impact of the catastrophe on the private sector, Cantor Fitzgerald and all of the other occupants of the World Trade Center buildings, and their efforts to rebuild. It was a lesson in the remarkable resilience of New York and complexity of thinking about emergencies. At that time, I am proud to say, the students of the School of International and Public Affairs also responded in ways that I think reflected well on them and on us as a school. We have students from many different countries, and they volunteered their services in many different ways, not least of which was bringing their proficiency in languages to help the families of victims of September 11th as they navigated the bureaucratic tangles that they confronted both here and at home. So it was a time when we both, in academic and practical terms, appreciated the kind of issues that we are going to be hearing about tonight. And I'm so very pleased as a result to have this opportunity to consider the future of these kinds of efforts, presumably less ad hoc than they seem to have been then, and more coordinated and thoughtful in the context, to this consideration, the context of the Weston Lecture. Just a moment on Dr. Weston himself. He died 6 months after September 11th, as it happens, at the age of 91, having had a truly remarkable career in many of the sectors that we've been talking about already. He was the founder of Carver Savings Bank. He was a developer of affordable housing. He was a minister, and he was Columbia's first black trustee. He was a remarkable figure, and I'm very pleased to report that he was delighted by the establishment of this lecture, to which he came several times before he died. He would have understood how important these kinds of networks across sectors and throughout the city are to its health and vitality. So I'm very pleased to be able to welcome our lecturer tonight. As you know, because you have his bio in front of him, he is Deputy Mayor for Administration, and in that capacity seems to run everything. Including working with the mayor in managing the police, fire departments, and the Office of Emergency Management, three of the particularly important arenas of the public sector that will be involved in emergency planning. He also has under in his responsibility, the Department of Sanitation, which, if anybody remembers, September 11th was also quickly implicated in how we responded. The Department of Citywide Administrative Services, and so forth. I can't think of a person better situated and better equipped to talk to us about the kinds of issues that we're going to have to be thinking about as citizens of New York in the coming decades, and I'm delighted to be able to have you here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dean Anderson. I'm going to try to live up to that billing. Thank you for having me. This is an interesting and special place and a special program, and it's fun to be with everybody here. I was talking to Dean Anderson before, and I'm aware about how the different backgrounds of everybody in this program, and also that everybody here is dedicated to public service, and as somebody who's worked essentially since college in public service, I appreciate that and respect that. I also want to acknowledge, so we have a couple members of the fire department here. Are you guys in the program, or are you just making sure I don't set myself on fire?
We're in the helping program. We're associated with Columbia University.
Great. Well, thank you also. I'm going to talk about basically emergency management, but focusing in on emergency communications and emergency planning and other things that begin with the word emergency. But first, I think we should take a step back and talk about where the city is. If you had said 5.5 years ago that the city's crime rate would be down 30%, that the unemployment rate would be at an all-time low, and we'd be building hundreds of thousands of units of housing, a lot of people wouldn't have believed you right after September 11th. But essentially, that's what's happened in this city. And what's also happened in this city is our emergency response, both capabilities and response mechanisms, have been significantly altered. But even though there hasn't been another terrorist attack, thankfully, in the last over the last 5.5 years, the city has had other challenges that it's had to deal with. We've had a citywide blackout. We've had a transit strike. We've had several aviation incidents. We've had an anthrax scare. We've had various terror alerts. And I wanted to show you some of the images associated with those because I think it's sort of, they all, to me, ring, even if it's not terrorism, we know what the first thing through people's minds. This was a barge explosion in Staten Island. I think you see some fireboats trying to put out the explosion. This is actually on the Kilvan Col, which separates Staten Island from New Jersey. And although this doesn't look like that big of a deal, at the time when the call first came in, we were told there's a mushroom cloud over Staten Island. So the first call that we had, indicated that there was a nuclear device that exploded over Staten Island, which is obviously, a major disaster. Thankfully, it was an accidental explosion, not criminally related. But if you look at this event from a different perspective, it looks eerily familiar to September 11th, with the plumes of smoke blowing to the east. Of people that are familiar with this picture on 9/11, obviously we've been further to the left, but this sort of picture can really send chills down the spine of New Yorkers, for obvious reasons. Here's another example. From the outside, this looks like another fire in an apartment. What this was Corey Lytle's plane crashing, the aftermath of Corey Lytle's plane crashing into the East River towards the end of last year. I think it was October of 06. And whenever in a city like New York, when you have, you're talking about planes crashing into buildings, you have something that we're obviously concerned about. Again, this was accidental, as the NTSB report indicated, but it's still frightening. So even when things are accidental or non-terrorist related, there's that sort of, I don't want to use the word patina, but that feeling of that this could be terrorism runs through everybody's mind, and it's can be quite scary when you're in the middle of it. When I get to this fun scene in a second. So one of the lessons from events in New York City and events nationally is the city really needs to be self-reliant. Police Commissioner Ray Kelly once said a couple of years ago, we can't wait for the cavalry to arrive, we are the cavalry. And his point being, we can't sit around waiting for state resources, waiting for the National Guard, waiting for the feds to come bail us out. We need to be able to help ourselves in a time of crisis. I think no event really indicated that lesson better than Hurricane Katrina, where you really saw a city that was unable to care for itself in a disaster. And they were basically rendered helpless until the federal government intervened. One of the direct lessons from 9/11, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time with it, it's a technical issue of communications among first responders. There was one of the areas the 9/11 report looks at is whether first responders could talk to each other. And now we have interoperable radio, so senior chiefs from the police department and the fire department can actually talk. You wouldn't want lower-level people talking because you want the commanders talking. You don't want lower-ranking police officer giving an order to a firefighter. You want there to be coordination at the top of the food chain, and that's what interoperable radios give you. And we have a new channel, citywide channel called Channel 16 that we're getting everybody to work, every first responder to have access to, so that everybody can communicate. Second is moving from voice to data. We signed a $500 million contract, that's $500 million with Northrop Grumman, to create a citywide data network that would move at about 1.2 megabytes a second. Now, our current citywide network moves about 19.2 kilobytes. Excuse me, the new one will be 1.2 megabytes. So it's about 50 times. It's the difference between going to a dial-up to a cable modem. So we're talking about a vast increase in capacity. This means a squad car out on patrol can get mugshots quicker. People can get diagrams for buildings. There's a whole lot of applications that could happen. So we are working on both the voice communication and the data communication, making significant investments in our infrastructure to make sure people can communicate and people can get the information, whether they're images or plans or whatever it is. But one thing that the city did not even have a start on September 11th was really the key capability to communicate directly with the public. And by that, I mean there was no ability other than through the media, through a press conference, through a radio station, through a wire service, for a public official to communicate directly with people in the event of an emergency. And that is really crucial. It's something we focused on in the early months of this administration. And why is that important? Well, let me give you a severe example, but one that is relevant, is that if a dirty bomb exploded somewhere in Midtown Manhattan, you'd want to make sure you can tell people where to go. You'd want to take account prevailing winds, and you want to make sure that if you give evacuation orders, that people are moving into safety, not into harm's way. So what did we do? We created a network of fiber optic lines. These are lines that carry voice and images that we can hook up to television cameras. So if necessary, the mayor can, anywhere at one of these sites, have a press conference or not a press conference, or just give a message similar to the president during the State of the Union when he sits behind the table and gives a speech, to be able to have the capability at City Hall and several other sites around the city to be able to say, here's the situation, here's what we're doing. But the advantage of being able to do that is you don't have to call for a press conference. You don't have to wait an hour for people to show up. You don't have to wait for reporters who get stuck in traffic. For example, when City Hall was closed temporarily when James Davis, the council member, was shot and killed there, reporters weren't allowed in the building. So we use this capability to tell people the mayor's alive, government is okay, there's been no interruption in government services, even though we had this tragedy. And without that, we would have had a very garbled message coming out of City Hall. But that's one way to do it. We wanted to institutionalize this even further. So we signed an agreement with the New York State Broadcasters Association, which deals with emergency alert systems. And you guys, I don't know if you were watching cartoons growing up, when you'd be watching Scooby-Doo and all of a sudden there's a beep and it says it's a test of the emergency broadcast system. It's a federal system that allows a federal official to override programming and give instructions. We now have the same capability so that even if the mayor isn't at one of these sites I discussed, he can pick up the phone, call in a message saying evacuate south of 14th Street or whatever the message may be, and it'll be carried on every television and radio station in New York City. And if they don't have his image, what they would have is a crawl that would be, a subtitle that went across the bottom of the screen. So as long as he has access to a phone, he can get a message out to millions of people. Now, granted, we're still relying on the media, but we're relying on them as a transmitter as opposed to, come and listen to me and feed it back. This is Times Square. I showed this image to you because every year at Times Square, when everybody's having a good time, we have secure facilities set up so that there is an event that that creates the need for the mayor to communicate with people and give instructions or give an update. We can do that. And it's somewhere in the city, and it's hooked up with fiber optic lines to other news media so they can take that signal and rebroadcast it to their viewers. And that's, people do respond to information. We saw during the blackout, during the heat wave last summer, when the Murray Hill network in the east side of Manhattan was under strain, and we put out a message saying people in this network really need to dial down their electric use. People did, and after those press conferences, kind of report to us a lowering of demand. So it's not just, for the sake of getting the publicity. It's for the, beyond the evening news. It's for, you can show an immediate impact to messages you put out in public and how people respond. And so it's important that we take advantage of that capability, which is what we've been trying to do over the last couple of years. I want to talk about two types of emergencies: one that happened and one that might or might not happen, but we have to prepare for. And the first one is the Con Ed blackout last summer. People remember that it took place in Western Queens, and there was an issue about the city's response. Here you can see a traffic cop who's directing traffic while this manhole is gone into, and you can see there's no traffic light on. And one of the issues with the city's response was, although the city put out extra police officers and EMS and firefighters out to the street to make sure we had more of a presence there, and although we had more sanitation pickups to make sure that spoiled goods would be taken away, and we set up loan programs to make sure that small businesses could be hurt, there was an issue of the city's response. And what was the issue? The issue was the city was relying on Con Ed to tell us how many people were out of power. And Con Ed said, well, we think about a couple thousand. So the city had a response essentially from a central point scaled to a couple thousand residents out of power. In reality, the response, the customers that didn't have service were a couple days later determined to be about 25,000 customers. And keep in mind, a customer can be one building, so that could be about 100 to 150,000, 200,000 people. And we got that feedback as we were out in the streets with the extra resources. We learned that we suspected that this was not a couple of thousand customers, this was 20,000 customers, but we had no way of knowing that. So after this blackout was fixed, we sat down in a room. I sat down with the chief of the fire department, an aide to the police commissioner, the head of emergency management, Joe Bruno, and the head of our community assistance unit and our information technology people, and said, how are we going to prevent this from happening again? So now, and we've developed something called the Power Outage Response Team. So now whenever there's a power outage in New York City, we have a team of police officers, somebody from the fire department, somebody from our community assistance unit, and what do? They do a canvass of the area. They use census data and mapping data from our Department of Information Technology and Telecommunications, and they give you an estimate how many people are affected. And we can get that estimate done within, it could be 30 minutes, could be 60 minutes, could be 2 hours, but it's quicker than waiting on Con Ed, because you know what? Con Ed doesn't know. Con Ed still, to this day, their numbers are not consistent with the Public Service Commission, who's doing a report on the blackout. Con Ed's numbers still are an estimate. So if they can't tell us and we can't rely on them, we got to figure it out ourselves. And it's sort of similar to what I was saying earlier, that the city basically has to be able to be dependent. When you have emergencies, you can see, like water main breaks, fires, they're visual. You can respond to them. When you have things that are harder to track, you have to make sure you have mechanisms in place to be able to deal with them. Jack Maple, who designed CompStat, the system that has helped track crime in New York City, and a lot of people feel led to the substantial reduction in crime in New York City, said if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And the blackout was a situation where being able to measure it better would have led to managing it better. So now let's talk about a disaster that hasn't happened. This is Lower Manhattan in the year 1950 after Nor'easter hit. And you can see that there's substantial flooding. New York City has never seen a Category 3 or 4 hurricane. Category 3 hurricane hit Long Island in 1950. It's known as the Long Island Express. But New York City has never had a Category 3 or 4 hurricane hit it. Now, does that mean that we should not plan for a Category 3 or 4 hurricane? Well, I guess if you want to roll the dice, you can do that. But the job of people in government and emergency planners is to figure out what possibly things could go wrong and plan for them. Because if there is a Category 3 or 4 hurricane in New York City, the answer, well, we didn't think it was going to happen, isn't going to get people the help they need, and it's certainly not going to be an excuse that anybody that lives here is going to want to hear. So part of the job is to figure out what are worst-case scenarios, how we're going to deal with them. New York's geography, although we're in the Northeast and we have cooler water temperatures, New York's geography has something that is called the New York Bight, which is this perpendicular angle formed by Long Island and New Jersey, which means that a storm hitting into this area will create quite a storm surge. What does that mean? In a Category 1 hurricane with winds at 74, 95 miles per hour, you can see these coastal areas are flooded. In a Category 2, stronger winds, even more inland areas are flooded. 3 and 4, you can see substantial flooding in a lot of southern Brooklyn, southern Queens, City Island, Lower Manhattan, Upper Manhattan, western and eastern and southern Staten Island, Coney Island's basically all underwater as are the Rockaways during this scenario. So this is something that the city has been planning for over the last couple of years, and we just refreshed our plan. And we now have a system that we could evacuate 3 million, a plan that calls for the evacuation of 3 million New Yorkers and the sheltering of 600,000 people at about 500 different shelters around the city. And we're stocking those in advance with food and water, training people to work there in advance. There would be city employees that would need to work there to be able to know what to need to do, what to do if people show up with pets, what to do if elderly people show up with plans for evacuating nursing homes, hospitals that are in low-lying areas. So we're partnering with the Red Cross on running the shelter system. So there might be only 1 in 100 chance of something like this happening, or maybe it's more likely to Category 2 or 3. But you can see even with Category 2, you have substantial flooding. We've seen Category 2 hurricanes. Hurricane Gloria in 1985, which hit New York, I believe was Category 2 when it hit Long Island, although not New York City. New York City got the western edge of the storm, but it's not impossible. So we need to plan for it because you never know. So what do? We also do, in addition to logistical planning, we do drills. This was out in Maspeth, Queens last year, and here you have members of the police department hazmat team. And what this drill simulated was a chemical device being detonated along a freight train, exploding as a passenger train was passing by at the same time. And that meant you had casualties of several hundred people on the passenger train as well as people on the freight train. So we learned a lot from this drill, and I actually remember watching some of it that day. And one of the things was we saw all these paramedics and EMTs do what they were trained to do, which is they saw people, we had people dressed up that are simulated as victims, lying there, and they have blood on them, and they're groaning and acting out the part. And we had, and so real EMTs showed up after a couple of minutes, and they rushed onto the site, and then they were declared dead by the controller of the drill, and they all had to lie down, and they couldn't help anybody, which is very frustrating because that's what their job is. And the reason is because there was a chemical agent that was in the air that basically killed them. And none of them were wearing protective suits. The next round of people EMTs got suited up. These were some police officers wearing hazmat gear, but got suited up, and then were able to take the wounded away after they were appropriately protected. So it was one of those lessons for everybody there that you need to make sure you know what you're dealing with before you rush in, despite what your instincts might be. During an emergency, we have a new state-of-the-art emergency operations center. This is in downtown Brooklyn. This is where you would have 100 desks of people from city agencies, state agencies, federal agencies, private sector, hospitals, utilities, public authorities like the MTA. The reason being, you need to get everybody in a room to coordinate an emergency, and everybody needs to work together, and the best way to do that is to put everybody in the same spot. So liaisons from the healthcare community, from the public safety community, all dealing with anything that could come up. We activated the EOC during the severe cold weather a couple of days ago. We'd activate during the severely hot weather last summer for a couple of days. And obviously, if there was another big emergency, it would be there. And this was funded generously by the federal government after our command center at 7 World Trade Center was destroyed on 9/11. We also do a lot of public-private partnerships to get people as trained as possible to be our eyes and ears out in the street. For example, the police department does training with one of the unions that has doormen in New York City in office buildings under the guise that if somebody's scoping out an office building, you need to have security guards and doormen at those office buildings trained to know how to detect that. So we have a 40-hour course where off-duty police officers and retired instructors from the police academy come in, and they train them on what to look for, what type of explosive devices, how to spot fraudulent documents like fake IDs, how to identify weak points in their security plans, how to communicate with everybody if there is an event. We also work on a broader scale with emergency preparedness. This is our new guide, Ready New York, for small, mid-sized businesses, and this will give people advice on how to do contingency planning. We also do a Ready New York, which you can find on nyc.gov, for people and for households that we've given out 3.5 million copies. We have 11 languages it's printed in because New York City is such a global city. So preparedness, both on the person-to-person and also business-to-business side, is a big priority. Also, a big part of emergency management is making sure you can detect an emergency when you have one. And that's why we set up a syndromic surveillance network at the health department. And they track intakes at hospitals. They track pharmacy prescriptions being filled. For example, if there was an outbreak of, let's say, anthrax, the city is supposed to be notified because of protocols that exist. But say a doctor starts, the city isn't notified, and people are prescribing a lot of the antibiotic Cipro in a part of Brooklyn, that would tip off the health department that there's an issue here that we need to look at, and we need to look at quickly. So part of, going back to the Con Ed lesson, part of it is tracking to know that you have systems in place to make sure that you do know there is a problem. If it's not hitting you over the head, if it's something that you need to have something to prevent it, something from bringing it to your attention, that you can track things on your own. We also, in dealing with the private sector, try to get public philanthropy to make the city safer. What you see here is a picture of a summit we had in Washington on illegal guns. We had 50 mayors come down to Washington and discuss the threat of illegal guns. Although the city does thousands of arrests each year of criminals caught with illegal firearms, 90% of them come from out of state. And if we don't have tougher gun laws across the country, we're not going to get anywhere, or we're not going to make as much progress in New York City as we'd like to. And I pointed out, because we were able to do a lot of these efforts bringing people from around the country, because we got private support from philanthropy. In this case, the Joyce Foundation was generous to help us do polling, helping to set up regional summits around the country to talk about the threat of illegal guns. And it's another way that we work with the private sector to find out where maybe city funds, taxpayer dollars, might not be as appropriate. You can find other sources of revenue to help move an agenda item forward and help make the city safer. I want to close on 2 items before I take your questions. And this is a map of the World Trade Center site, just to make the point that once the first responders are gone, emergencies have a way of sticking with you for a long time. It's certainly a lesson 9/11 on 2 areas that I'm involved in. And one is the ongoing search for human remains, and one is on the health effects of 9/11, which we're still dealing with. What you see here is a map of the World Trade Center site and the environment, and this yellow line denotes where the new search for human remains has been going on. That started in October. What happened was we found remains in an abandoned Con Ed manhole right about here. Found about, when we did an exhaustive search of that manhole, about 200 more human remains. Up and down this road, which is called the Hall Road, we found another 100 remains. Right here, the Deutsche Bank building, the southern end of the site, there's about 860 remains recovered. And we're searching about 700 manholes and subterranean structures within this yellow line for remains over the next several months. And this process will last at least until the fall of this year and possibly longer. And we use forensic anthropologists from the medical examiner's office to sift through every piece of material found from the site to screen for human remains. About 40% of the victims from 9/11 haven't been identified. And we hope that through this renewed effort, we'll be able to send remains home to families and provide them with the closure that everybody would want to have. The second is this report. I'm not going to go through it. It's 80 pages, but it's available online. And this is a report on the health impacts of 9/11. And what it does is it combs through medical data and treatment data from public and private institutions in New York City, as well as public registry information to find out what the health effects of 9/11 are and what we need to do to treat people who are sick, to track people who are sick going forward, and and how to compensate people that are sick, that have had loss of ability to earn wages or potentially even die some years after the fact. There was a victims' compensation fund set up right after 9/11, but that deadline has come and gone. So if someone presumably was to come down with an illness related to 9/11 and then die from it, they would have to basically sue in order to be, their family would have to basically sue to be compensated. We believe that if somebody can tie an illness or fatality to the terrorist attacks, that everybody should be treated equally, and that compensation fund should be reopened, and that's one of the recommendations in the report. There's also data and information on other treatment centers that are going on in the city, such as at Mount Sinai over on the east side, and the police department, and also the fire department, which has a health unit which treats for firefighters that would come down with illnesses that are 9/11 related, as well as the World Trade Center Environmental Health Center in Bellevue, which was on the cover of the Metro section of the Times today. Talked about how people without health insurance that weren't city workers can go there and get treatment. So I point this out just to show that even years later, when there's a real catastrophe in New York City, it sticks with you, and it's something that you need to keep working on and keep assessing what the ramifications and the outcomes are going to be. And that's something that sometimes is clearly a challenge. And it's not easy to go back to the federal government after they've given the state $20 billion and say, you need to give us $150 million a year more to help the city treat people, but we believe that it was an attack on America and it's a federal responsibility. And if you're interested in more of the findings from this report, I would ask you to go to wnyc.gov, or we can send you a copy and you can print it out also. So with that, if anybody has any questions, I would be happy to take them. How you doing, Chief?
One thing that I see, you might have said earlier, is the public announcement.
Right.
How that gets formulated and how it is addressed and letting those that watch it.
Right. I talked about that a little bit in the beginning, that we have signed a contract with the New York State Broadcasters Association. So the mayor, we did need to evacuate a portion of the city. For example, one of these areas, we could give out. The mayor would give the evacuation order. The emergency services would do what they need to do, and then people would hear it both over the radio, over the television, and they would see basically closed captioning of what the mayor was saying. And the mayor could do that from any cell phone. He could give that message, and it gets repeated over television or radio. Or he can do it from actually in front of a television camera, one of the facilities that we have that has a fiber optic link to other broadcast facilities.
Hi.
Hi.
My name's Alice Labrie, and just two quick things. First, I would like to ask consideration. I'm an advocate now for anyone who is the victim of NYPD error that results in injury or death, that there could be like a malpractice fund where no one has to sue. So you can talk to Peter Vallone about that more. I'm not comfortable with police being called criminals and using the word indictment. And second, I would like to know what are plans, if any, for evacuation by water in case of emergency?
We have had evacuations by water. There was a good amount of people evacuated by water on 9/11. There's actually a great book done on it called Calling All Boats. I think that's what it's called. But we saw a lot of it during the blackout. The reality is that although we are, I think, 3 islands in a peninsula, we don't have an infrastructure that is really suited towards mass evacuations by water. We have some ferry terminals, but they couldn't handle the hundreds of thousands of people that you would need to handle. So what we would do in an emergency, for example, such as this, is we would have special lanes and we have police department, highway officers out there closing down lanes that would open up more lanes for vehicle traffic. We would use the MTA buses whenever possible. We'd also coordinate with the transit system so that subway service could be beefed up in areas where it would need to be. Go ahead.
It seems that a lot of the emergency planning is reactive and speculative based on an event that either happened in New York or elsewhere. Is this hurricane plan that came post-Katrina? And also, in addition to that, are there areas in which the city is planning this current?
Yeah, I'll tell you a funny story about that. The answer to this specific plan is it existed before Katrina, and Katrina made us take another look at it, and it is much more, I believe it is a much stronger plan the evacuation centers and the hurricane shelters are now funded so that we can actually make sure so that there'll actually be food and water and supplies there if we need to open them, and if we don't need to use them, then that's just sort of a cost of governing, and that didn't exist before. And there's been a lot more logistical work by all the relevant agencies. As far as other events that could happen, I met with the mayor and Commissioner Joe Bruno, the OEM commissioner, a couple months ago, right at the beginning of the snow season. And he said, well, what happens if we have back-to-back huge snowstorms? We're not used to having, but we have occasionally have 1 foot, 2 feet of snow in New York City. And the mayor said, well, what happens if you have 2 feet of snow one day and 2 feet of snow the next day? And we looked at him and said, we don't really think that's that likely, but we'll see. We'll take a look at our winter weather plan and look to bulk it up. And sure enough, over the last couple of weeks, you've seen, I think, 10 feet of snow fall in upstate New York. So even though we were somewhat skeptical that when the mayor raised this, a couple of months later, it was proven that's quite possible in this region for that to happen. And we do now have an updated winter emergency plan that shows that that would help get resources to people that are homebound, that can't get out, that would be isolated until we could plow the streets. We would also be reaching out to contractors to get more equipment, because although the city has 2,000, 2,500 snow plows, you would really need a lot of front-end loaders and dump trucks to pick up the snow and put them in, because when you have a couple feet of snow, just pushing to the side just means that somebody's going to be unable to move somewhere else. So it's a good question, and part of OEM's job is to basically sit there and think of things that can go wrong. And then, if it's a 5% chance or a 0.2% chance, that's, better to be safe than sorry, right? Sir?
I have two questions about the financial and budgetary aspects of the emergency plan. For 2 years, Mayor Rudolph has been asking for more money. The federal government didn't talk in a congressional hearing about this. Have you felt in your experience any restriction, any money restrictions in all these plans the city has been developed? Does this money, the federal government, it's necessary this money the federal government needs to get to New York in order to better preparedness?
Right. Well, there's been a big debate over Homeland Security funds in Washington, and the city has argued these funds should be threat-based, and no city has been attacked twice by terrorists and targeted, I think about a dozen and a half times in unsuccessful attempts. And we make a pretty strong case that that all the Homeland Security money should be dedicated by risk. It's about $1 billion a year or so. Unfortunately, Congress and the administration have chosen to spread it around like spread around as political pork, and have not given the city its fair share. So even when they set up a special pot of money for high-risk cities, that city grew to 50 or 60 cities long, and there's no way that those cities share the same risks as New York, which is not fathomable. And you hear about sheriffs in small towns, having an embarrassment of riches. They're getting Homeland Security funds for high-tech command centers to patrol the mushroom picking contest. They're not targets, and it's a sham. That being said, we spend several $100 million a year on counterterrorism, intelligence, emergency preparedness, and the mayor said he'll pay the bills, and whatever the federal government can do to help, great, but we have a responsibility here, and we're going to deal with it. Obviously, more funds would be helpful, but we've taken the position that this is, public safety is the #1 priority in New York City, and it's got to be funded. Ma'am.
What's our efforts in New York done with regional coordination since some emergencies reaching out to borough?
Right. Well, if we take a look at the command center picture, there are desks there for people from the Port Authority, which involves New Jersey, from the MTA, which reaches into Connecticut as well as upstate New York. We do have regional coordination meetings We meet regularly with the State Office of Emergency Management, CMO. Everything in government's got a funny acronym that you got to memorize. So that's CMO as opposed to the city's OEM, and opposed to the federal government, FEMA. So we do a lot of coordination, especially with the hurricane plan, because we believe that a lot of people will be driving through, from Nassau and Suffolk. Although people will go inland if they have to evacuate, they also might be driving through New York City to go upstate. So that's going to impact our transportation infrastructure as well. So you're right, we're not alone here, and we need to remember that something here affects our neighboring counties and municipalities. Sir.
Does the city do work with large employers, sort of from preparation for how they evacuate their buildings and how their buildings might be used, to what role they might play in the recovery?
Right. OEM and the police department both, and the fire department both help with evacuation drills. I know that the mayor was happy that Bloomberg LP, which has a new building on 59th Street, the old Alexander site, did an evacuation drill. And we have the police department has a system called Apple where they work with covert security directors to make sure they're informed of the latest techniques. And in the recovery, we do have something called POMS. And I confess I forgot the acronym right now, but it's somewhere in here. And it stands for something about asset locate management. And what that means in English is the city has a database so that if it needs fuel, if it needs water, if it needs food, if it needs equipment, if it needs protective clothing, if it needs medicine, we have a database of providers that we can call and say, we need 4,000 latex gloves, or we need 4,000 respirators, so that the city might not have them on stock, but we know where to go to get them, and that can help. That we tapped into that during the Queen's blackout last summer. Sir, you have one.
My name is Conley Rollins. I'm a student at the business school, and I was wondering if you could talk about how your background as being the mayor's press secretary has sort of shaped your approach to overseeing the emergency management effort, because a lot of what you've talked about today is communicating with the public.
Yeah, I think, one of the reasons I started with talking to the public was because when I first got involved and we were thinking, when every other agency was, okay, well, how do we respond to 9/11, increasing our capability, I was quickly clear that Mayor Giuliani during 9/11 didn't have a direct way to communicate with the public. First of all, their command center was destroyed. And second of all, press wouldn't be able to show up. What you need to do is you need to be able to independently communicate, so you're not dependent on reporters. And it's not about being Orwellian about it. It's about getting information to people. So that's why we set up that infrastructure off the bat and signed that deal with the Broadcasters Association. I think that having been in the middle of a bunch of emergencies, citywide blackout and transit strike and barge explosions and other fun things, it's really the lesson is that you need to wait and get available information before you act, not to the point of being indecisive, but to find out that balance of when you have enough to talk to people and when it would be premature. You don't want to go out, give out information, and then 5 minutes later say, well, actually, I was wrong. So there's a time in an emergency sometimes where people get antsy, where they say, we need to do a press conference, we need to talk to people. And they're right in the sense, okay, you want to get out there and tell people what you know. At the same time, if you're not 100% sure of your information, then you're not giving, and then it's later contradicted, you're not really giving them a lot of confidence. One of the tricks on a coastal storm plan, on a hurricane plan, where what if you see a storm coming and you evacuate, these low-lying areas of the Rockaways and City Island and Northwest Bronx, Northeast Bronx, and other areas, and then the storm takes a right turn, goes out over the Atlantic, and we don't have a problem. The next time you want to evacuate people go, well, they did this last year, and it turned out to be nothing. So maintaining credibility with the public is just as important, I think, as having the electronic infrastructure to communicate with them. All right, if that's it. Okay, well, thank you for having me.
You're welcome.